This lecture will introduce the Impressionist Exhibitions that ran from 1874 to 1886 and arguably fundamentally changed the direction of the art world, though we have seen the elements building up to it ever since the early 19th century movements, and especially those mid-century such as realism. Now, by the 1870s, there were many alternatives artists had to the official French salon. The famed Durand-Ruel Gallery allowed exhibitions, for instance, year-round, so artists could make a name for themselves at any point in time instead of waiting for one time a year. Thanks to gas spotlights, we now can have visitors and buyers coming in even in the evenings after hours when they get off work. And this would surpass the salons even in its tasteful presentation. So we find that now we have a competition set up between the rather traditional academic salon and the new economy and the new art market, such as the gallery system. The Impressionist exhibitions were a long time coming, since the dissatisfaction with the salon had led admirers of both Courbet and Monet to break from the establishment in 1873. They then founded the Private Company of Artists. Now, in 8 group shows that are now referred to as the Impressionist Exhibitions that ran from 1874 to 1886, they rented out the studio of Nadar, the renowned photographer in Paris, and exhibited 150 works by 35 different artists. There were over 30,000 visitors to just the first exhibition alone. Now, perhaps the best known of the Impressionists, Claude Monet, was a good example of the types of artists that exhibited here. Now, most of these artists were in their mid-30s and had been rejected multiple times by the Salon since the mid-1860s. Now, Monet specifically had an indifference to subjects, as did many of the Impressionists. They would produce landscapes and genre scenes, or contemporary scenes of urban life. These were not traditional categories that you would see in a salon. Now, Monet was a student of Charles Glier, who was a juste milieu painter, and that's where he would have met Renoir, Basile, and Sisley in the same studio. The first show in 1874 was written about by Louis Leroy and is review of the Exhibition of the Impressionists, which of course was a slanderous term, as he is going to deride them for merely making impressions of paintings. Now, the exhibits here ran the gamut from conservative subjects and styles to the quite liberal, the conventional to the innovative. And the group thus adopted this pejorative term of Impressionists, taking the power away from it that Leroy had used against them. Here we have the painting that very often is credited for giving Impressionism its name, the Impression Sunrise, painted in 1872 and exhibited in that first exhibition. You find that the work is signed and dated in the lower left-hand corner, as are many of them for the Impressionists, because unlike making paintings for the French Salon, where you would have the ability to go see it and you would have a pamphlet outlining who everyone was exhibiting there, the Impressionists are going to start painting in the dealer-critic system for the audience at large, that being the general public will walk in off the street to one of these galleries and buy these paintings. Therefore, signing them is very important for the notoriety of artists. Now, in Impression Sunrise, what we actually have is the reflection of the orange ball of the sun in the off-axis right, which is reflected in the same colors, mixing a kind of peach, white, and orange in the choppy waves below, whereas the sky above is illuminated. Now, the actual subject, which is painted here in complementary colors of orange and blue, right, again giving you that shimmering iridescent effect, is taken from the harbor of Le Havre, which is in Normandy, the northern coast of France, where Monet spent his youth. And we find that Monet will always gravitate towards water scenes. So at the very end of his life, most famously, he's going to be painting his water lilies. But if we look at a photograph of what he is going to be painting, you'll notice that the factories, the smokestacks, and the industrial blight that we normally would have that wouldn't be picturesque is not detailed. We find that they are going to be backlit with the sun. In the foreground, we have these figures in boats, hastily sketched out. And instead of showing the subjects as these architectural structures or people in the foreground, the subject for Monet becomes light and atmosphere, how we experience the world, which is not always crisp and detailed and in focus, but is still going to be, nevertheless, optically how we would see a very foggy or hazy sunrise or sunset. Unlike the naturalists who would freeze reality in a photographic-like quality, we now again are emphasizing the fleeting nature of reality, in which we see something left sketchy and unfinished. Here we do not see the hiding of brushwork as in academic painting like Bouguereau, but instead we are emphasizing it, leaving it visible for all to see. And this becomes a hallmark of many of the Impressionists, but not all, we should add. What is important to note here is that sketches and oil sketches are going to be commonly submitted to the salon and labeled as such, but Monet, importantly, did not call his sketches. Therefore, that's what was so scandalous about it, trying to pass off what would recently be considered a sketch as a finished work. And we see that as well in Le Grenouiller, or the Frog Pond here of 1869. Now here he's going to be working on this painting when the Franco-Prussian War broke out. Now he intended to finish it in a much larger finished version for the Salon. However, he had fled to London to avoid being drafted in the Franco-Prussian War. There he sees Turner and his works that blurred the boundary between a sketch and a finished painting. He then returns and exhibits Le Grenouiller as a finished work and believed it necessary to complete it en plein air. Therefore, traditionally finished works are going to be completed in the studio. So he initially intended to work on the Frog Pond painting out on site and then take it back and have a more academic finish when he returned to his studio. This is the breaking point, though, of merely exhibiting it as you're working on it en plein air. Now, we find that Monet is encouraged by Boudon, and his fashionable beach scenes that he's known for are sold to summer tourists and also made outdoors. So there is a precedent for this. But we find here the beach at Trouville would not have been exhibited at the Salon in the same way. The immediacy and the impact made possible working en plein air, and we find here this began made possible in the 1850s, while outdoor sketching was possible thanks to now being able to purchase paint in tubes. And so now we can bring the paint already in the proper colors we need without bringing pig's bladders like we discussed before. And so this is now much more readily available and possible to the general public. Now, unlike Lepage and his haymakers, there is a different purpose to the paintings working en plein air than the naturalists had working outdoors. We find that they are capturing this immediacy and fleeting moment instead of the photographic and detailed quality of a scene. There were many artists exhibiting during the Impressionist exhibitions. One was Camille Pissarro. Here we see his White Frost of 1873. Now we find that Leroy is going to lump Monet and Pissarro together, but they had quite different approaches. Monet would always favor water scenes, whereas Pissarro loved rural landscapes. Here, Monet is going to use broad horizontal strokes to emphasize his water scenes and the reflections on them, whereas Pissarro uses short, fuzzy dabs of paint to showcase the clear, thin air of a winter's day. Now, Alfred Sisley is going to be the Brit working at this time in Paris, and he also favors water scenes as he, of course, remembers the Thames River, but is going to produce them in a very different way than Monet. Here is Inundation of the Loge Island of 1872. We can see how he's using subdued gray light, which is going to betray his British descent. Now, like Monet, again, he is interested in water scenes, and he always lived near the Seine in Paris, but he would prefer, again, these river scenes as opposed to Monet's. Monet, of course, really prefers the ocean and the sea. Now, if we compare Sisley to Monet, there are no sparkling sunlight effects. We have expanses of water that are often punctuated by vertical elements, so the compositional devices in Sisley are going to differentiate him from that of Monet. He's not interested in light and atmosphere. You're always going to have a rather British appeal to the type of gray tonality he brings to his paintings. The difference in Monet and the rest of the Impressionists is also made clear by 1877 with the third Impressionist Exhibition, where he showed 3 paintings of the Gare Saint-Lazare, or the main train station in Paris. Here is a photograph of the Gare Saint-Lazare, and we can see what he is and is not showing. He is going to be interested in the effects of light and atmosphere at different times of the day. So he starts adopting a series approach, whereby he's going to choose the same subject and paint it at different times or with different effects. Here we find that the solid structure of the train station dissolves among the smoke and steam produced by the locomotives, the very essence of modern technology. Now, there are 12 views in total that he eventually produces at different times of the day and from different angles. Now, again, the Gare Saint-Lazare represents modern life in chaos and instability, and thus stands in for modernism in general and what it's like to live in the day as things are shifting so rapidly. From the 1880s onward, we increasingly see this interest in groups or series of paintings showing the shifting nature of perception itself. Now, from 1883 to 1886, Monet would take his summer vacations at Étretat, France's north coast. There were dozens of studies of these chalk cliffs and showing the effects of changeable light on these rocks. Here, with the Monet Porte Étretat of 1883, we have the cliffs that are not just painted in a dull gray, but instead we can see flicks and flecks of orange, pink, blue, violet, green, and yellow. So the full gamut and range of the spectrum reflects with the light of the crashing waves and refracts off of the area of the beach and these rocks. So he's painting, importantly, not what he knew was there, which would be beige-gray rock, but instead what he actually saw, the reflection and refraction of light off of the water that changes the color of even a rather neutral tone, such as rock. Now, this does have a scientific precedent of the day. Hermann von Helmholtz, in his Handbook of Physiological Optics from 1856 to 57, is going to be the link to the scientific theories of vision and the Impressionists. He would write that the brains, our brains, adjust what we see in reality to what we're expecting to see. Thus, this causes perception to be quite inadequate and incorrect. We expect that rock is going to be this type of beige-gray color, or cement is going to be gray. But if we look carefully and pay attention and untrain our minds to see what we expect to see, then the full gamut of optical perception is possible. So here with Monet, we see this carried out from scientific theory to, again, artistic investigation, showing us what we actually see and not what we know we should be seeing. Turning now to the treatment that the Impressionists had of the human figure, they fall into two different categories, one of outdoor settings and the other of urban settings. But they both are going to showcase the contemporary leisure activity of the upper middle class, of the bourgeoisie. So here, realists and naturalists are going to focus on peasants and the urban poor, if at all. Now, these were politically charged messages, making the middle class feel guilty about their perceived leisure and status. Leisure, importantly, was the byproduct of capitalism. Most of the middle class did not work throughout the year. Importantly, women never were expected to work, especially if they were in the middle class. That would suggest that their husbands were not able to provide for them. So here we find Monet using his wife as a model in his Women in the Garden painting of 1866 to 67. Now, this was painted outdoors to capture the effects of bright sunlight on the figures in white dresses. Now, this is modeled after Manet's painting of Le Déjeuner sous l'herbe, but was actually painted indoors. Monet is going to blend the figures and the scene together, while completely abandoning chiaroscuro modeling as Manet had done, that is, including black in the shadows, for instance. Now, shading instead would be done in colors, especially green and not black. Like Delacroix before him, Monet would note that shadows are tinted by the surrounding colors and never are merely going to be black, just as light is merely never just a white color. Turning now to Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who was more known for the figure in Impressionism than anyone else. We have someone who is trained in a porcelain factory, and then with the artist Charles Glier with Monet. He would be the first, actually, to apply the Impressionist brushstroke to figure painting itself. He, unlike Monet, generally chooses to paint middle-class individuals in their leisurely time. In this case, men and women dancing together at an open-air dance hall called Le Moulin de la Galette, which is right next to Le Moulin Rouge on Montmartre. This is going to be in the summer, an open-air area where young men and women could gather together and dance, right, appropriately and with chaperones. So here we find that the group on the dance floor are going about their activities, whereas these young women are going to be flirted with by these men sitting across from them on this bench. As noted, this was a popular dance hall and cafe in Montmartre, in an old windmill. On summer Sundays, young people would be here dancing to a band, and so it's a seasonal and very popular place for the young to congregate. Now here we see the short brushstrokes that evoke dappled light, but unlike that of Monet, who had thick horizontal strokes, we have here short vertical strokes, and we see them most clearly in the details of the painting with the figures that are going to be in the foreground right. The brushstrokes that are used to illustrate the figures are very blotchy, unfinished, and are otherwise not used to detail what is happening, but instead just suggest the shimmering nature of light coming through these trees as the figures dance. Thus we get a momentary glimpse of their activities instead of the completely focused and detailed rendering and classical composition more common with academic painting. We turn now to Edgar Degas, who was one of the founding members of the private company of artists, and also one who focused on the human figure, but his paintings would be very different than Renoir. He would participate in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions, but he had no interest in light and atmosphere. Instead, he would investigate the field and angle of vision, especially with the perception of moving bodies, most famously relating to the ballet. His would focus on scenes of urban life and indoor scenes, and he was even categorized as a realist and a naturalist during the time. Here in his ballet rehearsal, we have a good example of the type of painting that Degas was known for. Here we have a behind-the-scenes look of a world dominated by women. Here we can see the actual rehearsal in the background to the left, obscured by a staircase, with someone walking down in the upper left-hand corner. The teacher, an instructor, is actually off in the very background to the right in a red shirt. Foregrounded to the right, we actually have a seamstress who's working on the tool of this ballerina who is bent over, the other one with a green shawl waiting her turn seated next to her. Now here again we have, like the railroad or the Gare Saint-Lazare by Manet, a random glimpse, a fleeting moment of reality, something that we could see, but now a glimpse into a world that men rarely saw, the background before a ballet. Now this is not a traditionally posed ballet either. We are reflecting the reality in a succession of glimpses, as though we had just walked in and we have this random grouping of scenes together. The oblique viewing angle again comes from Japanese prints, and Japanisme, or the interest in Japanese woodblock prints, would be very influential for the Impressionists, the Neo-Impressionists, and the Post-Impressionists to follow them. Here we can see a large open flat area as we look down on the dance floor here, but it also opens up obliquely as we can also see the figures to the right and background left. In keeping with his interest in entertainment for the bourgeoisie, we would ask, what did they go and see to be entertained? And one would be the ballet, obviously. The other would be horse races. So we find here the horse race is the counterpart to the ballet because it is dominated now by men. It is a modern activity like the ballet involving watching. Here we see a horse off to the left as they get ready in front of the stalls, one spooking in the background in the middle. But we have an asymmetrical arrangement, a wide open area of negative space in the middle, and an oblique viewing angle. The oblique viewing angle is what is so significant as it's going to foretell the awkward cropping in modernist paintings with these random compositions that are often off-axis. The interest in horses and the movement of horses especially is going to be tied to another emergent technology, photography. Now Edward Muybridge around the same time would be producing a series of photographs that sought to ascertain whether or not all of the horse's legs came off the ground while in full gallop. As seen here in stop motion, they certainly do, as in frame 2 and 3. The interest in the stop-motion images were also printed in French journals, so there is an element of popular culture involved here in showing the new technology and then disseminating it among the masses. Here is perhaps one of his most startling paintings relating to the races. Here are jockeys before the start, and this is going to be pastel on paper with an essence of oil. So here we have an empty space to the left with a horse jumping to the right, whereas the horse closest to us is cut off. Its head is cut in two. The randomness here and the casual glimpses are clearly seen in this work in a very graphic way. Another artist who would be famous for his urban street scenes is Gustave Caillbotte. Unlike most of his compatriots and colleagues, he was wealthy and could afford to be a patron as well as an artist. He would be known for especially casual walkers in street scenes and reviving the male nude. In his painting at the Art Institute of Chicago, seen here, Paris, A Rainy Day of 1877, we have a work that obviously used photographs when assembling it because it does have a photographic quality to it. However, we find that it is still asymmetrically oblique and disjointed, like Renoir's impressions we saw a moment ago of Japanisme. In the work, we find a rainy day with individuals dressed in black, carrying their umbrellas, going various directions. We are supposedly on a sidewalk looking slightly down at an oblique angle. This couple walking towards us, while a gentleman to the far right is awkwardly cropped right down the middle. We find that the couple looks off to their right to direct our attention to these men that are wearing black and carrying the same umbrellas, walking then to the right. So we have a large open expanse in the center left that's going to echo the wide open bright sky. Now, the photographs used, which very often were destroyed by modern artists because they did not want to be accused of copying, demonstrate his knowledge of the distortive qualities of lenses, but then also accurately capturing the view of the new modern city streets and housemanization. We find that the awkward cropping again is also going to be derived from that approach seen with Renoir. So we have a very asymmetrical scene with most of the positive space on the right-hand side of the composition, but a very disjointed approach, right, in which figures are not looking at nor are they acknowledging one another. You find that instead, our viewing angle is always going to be directing us to another object, another person, who then is going to direct our attention back. So we are walking on the sidewalk closest to this man and woman, but they do not acknowledge us. They look off to the right. Thus, we look off to the right to see no focal point, no focalizer. Instead, we have various other figures that are going about their own days in different directions. Therefore, we have this disjointedness, this discomfort that is very common in modern life with this new alien environment and city, the city of the tourist, not of Parisians as they thought. All right, so just to show you the composition divided in half or transected with this lamppost is going to bring our attention inward as we're walking on the sidewalk towards the couple, who then direct our attention off to our left. But there is nothing there as they draw our attention back. Thus, there is no focal point in modernity, and everything is changing and everyone is moving and it will be in flux. Here in his floor scrapers, we have the second category for which Caillbotte would be known for, the male nude. So here, reintroducing it, we have three men who are shirtless scraping the floor, preparing it to be refinished. Now, like the earlier version, it looks photographic, and the idea that he could have used photographs is certainly highly probable. Of course, he would have likely destroyed them instead of showing his cards, as it were. But here we can see the photographic finish for which he is known, the forced perspective that's going to move us off dramatically into the distance quite rapidly. So here, the stooped poses are not demeaning like the earlier examples of labor, but instead are tied to masculine strength and honest labor. This is linked, presumably, to the artist's homosexuality, but is part of a larger trend as well, to revive the academic male nude, which had last been revived by Jacques-Louis David. Turning now to the female members of the Impressionists, we have Berthe Morisot. Now, there was a growing number of professional women artists at the time, we should note. Before 1870, however, most worked in lower genres, such as landscape, portraiture, and still life. These are known as lower because they take less education to carry out in an efficient fashion. Therefore, you don't need as much background in the male nude. Now, they also would be known for lesser media and working in porcelain painting, watercolor, and pastel. By the 1870s, we have masculine terms that we have here, aided by professional training that allow them to break out and into these more accepted areas. Private schools, for instance, emerged that would train women, while the academy still would not let women take part in nude life drawing sessions. So this is the important sticking point for women's education that is going to prohibit them from working in high art. Now, Morisot, importantly, was an amateur who married Manet's brother. Thus, we see the scenario throughout the early modern era as well, whereby women can come to gain prominence in the art world if they are related to or marry into an artistic family. So Morisot is going to be known for the public and private lives of women. Her subject matter is taken from her own visual experience, it is often noted, such as nurseries, because men were not allowed in nurseries at the time. So much like the backstage at a ballet rehearsal, this is a women's world. So nurseries were used, for instance, to model women's latest fashion, since men were not allowed in there. And so in wood engravings and other advertisements and magazines and newspapers, we would often see these scenes showcased, but not in fine art. The painterly approach seen here, combined with the novel subject matter, you haven't seen anything like it thus far, is going to set Morisot apart from her contemporaries. Of course, again, we have a very interesting, awkwardly cropped scene with very loose brushwork and an interesting approach. It's not going to be the brushwork of Renoir or Monet as they focus on light and atmosphere, nor is it the finished work of Caillbotte. Another one of these artists in the circle of the Impressionists is Mary Cassatt. Unlike Morisot, she was formally trained from the Philadelphia Academy of Art and then in the atelier of Jerome Couture and others, the workshops of famous Parisian painters. She settled in Paris in 1874, and her subject matter can be described as modern and feminine. She attracted the attention of Degas, who invited her to participate in the fourth Impressionist exhibition. Here, in her Woman in a Loge of 1879, we see a woman with the lights on before the opera begins. Behind her is a massive mirror reflecting the opposite balcony. We can see as she is seated, leaning back, that she is excited and uneasy, biting on her lip, knowing she is on display. We looked at, again, an element of this earlier with Granville's Venus at the Opera, whereby wearing a low-cut dress, she is at the same time embarrassed about her nakedness, but also happy with the attention. So these elements that are unique to feminine experience, that the male impressionists would not be able to access. Again, we have the popular entertainment here of the bourgeoisie going to the opera, the ballet, or the horse races. So the subject matter will be the same. As well, we're using a mirror to inform us of the location and also standing in for the shifting notion of modernity at this time. The notion of seeing someone randomly and then the visual acuity and understanding and perception of modernity shifting quickly as we glance someone from across the balcony or across the bar and do not interact with them and move on to something else. Here in Her Little Girl in a Blue Armchair, we have another very interesting approach to the subject that male impressionists would not have had. Here we have a young girl with her skirt pulled up, her legs spread apart. Very, very improper for a young lady who is rebellious here against good manners. This is a radically new image of children instead of one that is very innocent, that also brings in some of these adult themes that will be popular in the 20th century. The bird's eye view cuts off the room at the windows as though we're replicating what a child sees from their angle. Later on, we see these types of themes carried out in the early 20th century. Therefore, Impressionism is going to center around modern bourgeois life with an interest in lighting effects and new strategies for viewing the world. We can now have a randomness of compositions that reflect the fleeting nature of modern life and modernity in general, what it's like to live during this time. Next class, we'll continue on with the next generation that carries on this trend with the Neo-Impressionists beginning with Seurat.